Hello everybody, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Sukkah. We'll be learning today B'Yas Hashem, Daf Peites Amud Aleph. We will pick up today on near the bottom of Peiches Amud Beis in Siman Tafresh Chaf Tes Sif Hey, where we are continuing to discuss the halachos of schach. What types of materials can and cannot be used for schach? So says the Mechaber here in Sif Hey. If you remember yesterday in Sif Dalid, we were speaking about pishton. We were speaking about flax and partially processed or unprocessed flax. Now the Mechaber says, B'chavolim mishel pishton. If we have ropes that were made out of flax, psula, these ropes would be puzzle for schach, shel gemi v'shel siv. But if they're made out of different types of reeds, kshera, they would be kosher. Now, what exactly is the problem over here with these ropes? So the Mishnah Berurah says in Ice Cut Yud Gimel, shel pishton, if we're talking about ropes that are made out of pishton, af she'ein mekablin tuma, even though these ropes are not mekabel tuma, and the reason they would not be mekabel tuma is because they are not considered kalim. And if you take a look in the Sharet Tzion, Ice Cut and Chaf, he brings this down from the Rambam. He says, Rambam Perak Aleph Milchus Kalim Halacha Yud Beis, who says that these ropes would not constitute kalim, and therefore they would not be makabel tumah. However, Lodas Rashi b'Masechta Shabbos b'Daf Samar Daled Davke kishalei nitvu mitchila. Rashi would agree that they're not considered kalim if the flax was not spun into threads before it was twisted into a rope. Avalim nitvu. However, if the fibers of the flax were first twisted into threads, and then you took those threads and you braided them into ropes, hu bechlal orig. According to Rashi, this would constitute a woven end product, ayin sham. In that case, it would be considered a keli, and it would be makabel tuma, umin HaTorah ein mesachekin b'hen. So, what we're going to have over here in this Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Gimel, is going according to the sheet of the Rambam. According to the sheet of the Rambam, no matter how you form these ropes are not considered kalim. And therefore, the Mishnah Berurah says, Av she'ein mekabelin tuma, even though according to the Rambam, these ropes are not mekabel tuma, and therefore we have to wonder, why are they not kosher for schach? They're gedulei karka, they're not mekabel tuma, so what's the problem? It's tzemeach min ha'adama, it's not a keli, it's not mekabel tuma, why can't it be schach? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, mikamakim, nevertheless, nishtanet tzurasan, and this is something which we already discussed yesterday. Once you take the flax and you twist it into a rope, it changes its appearance in a very significant way. It no longer looks like gedulei karka. Nobody looks at that and says, wow, this is something that grew from the ground, and therefore it's not kosher as schach. Upashut says the Chavetz Chaim, Tehu hadin b'chavolim shel canvas, that if you have ropes of hemp, I don't know what the mitzias over here is, but apparently the Chavetz Chaim was saying that ropes made out of hemp certainly do not look like something which is tzemeach min ha'adama, and therefore they are certainly not kosher for schach. However, at the end of Sif Hey, the Mechaber did end off by saying shel gemi v'shel siv. If you're talking about these kinds of ropes, these are things apparently that are not nishtanet tzurasan. They still look like something which is tzemeach min ha'adama, and therefore they would be kosher. Now we go to Siv Vav, which is a somewhat complex sif. Let's see the Mechaber here in Siv Vav. B'machatzeles shel konim, let's say you have a mat that was made out of reeds. V'kash, or it was made out of straw. V'shifa, shifa, my understanding is this is some kind of a softer type of reed. V'gemi, this is some kind of a grass. So you have these reeds that were made out of things that are tzemeach min ha'adama, but now they were woven into these mats. Bein shehi chalaka, says the Mechaber here, whether they are smooth, shehi ru'uya l'shchiva, and therefore they can be used as a mat to lay on, because it's a smooth mat that somebody would use for that purpose. Bein she'ena chalaka, or whether it's not smooth, she'ena ru'uya l'shchiva, so that it's not very usable to lay on. Now, I inserted those words based on the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber says here, Bein she'ena halachos she'ena ra'uya l'shchiva, or even if they are not smooth and they're not royal l'shchiva, they cannot be used as a mat to lay on. The Mishnah Berurah amends that, and the Mishnah Berurah says it can't be that they're not royal l'shchiva at all. If they're not royal l'shchiva at all, they're certainly not makabel tumah, and then why wouldn't they be usable as schach? So the Mishnah Berurah says that when the Mechaber says Eina halachos she'ena ra'uya l'shchiva, he means that they're not smooth and therefore they're not very usable for shchiva, but they are usable for shchiva in a pinch. If you need something to sleep on, you'll sleep on it. Now, the problem with a mat that's usable for sleeping purposes is that that's something which is roy l'kabel tumah. Which tumah are we referring to? Tumas medris. We know that one type of tumah is a zav or a zava. If they sit on something, lean on something, if they use something to support that weight, their weight, then that item becomes tamei tumas medris. Now, a mat that can be used for laying on is something which is ready to be used for shchiva, and therefore, even if it wasn't used for shchiva yet, it's roy l'kabel tumas medris. If it's royal l'kabel tumas medris, it cannot be used for schach purposes. So far the Mechaber here says, if we're talking about a mat, whether it's royal l'shchiva, or even if it's not so royal l'shchiva, but it's royal l'shchiva in a pinch, says the Mechaber, what's the halacha? Im hi ketana, if it's a small mat, so it's a mat which is of the size that somebody would use it for shchiva purposes, so then, stama imedes l'shchiva, umekabeles tuma. If it's a small mat, then the default position is that it's something which is ready to be used for laying on, and therefore it's a royal l'kabel tumas medris, ve'ein mesachichin ba, and therefore you cannot use it for schach. So you have this mat, a small mat. The default position of this small mat is that it is something that somebody would use for shchiva. Then it's royal l'kabel tumas medris, and then it's pasul for schach, ein mesachichin ba, and the Mechaber gives a caveat, and he says, Ela imkein asa l'sichuch, unless it is something that was made for schach. Now, right away the Ramah jumps in, and the Ramah qualifies what the Mechaber just said. The Mechaber said the default position is, if it's small, in that case it's a medes l'shchiva, and since it's a medes l'shchiva, the default position is, it is for shchiva, it's royal l'kabel tumas medris, and therefore it's pasul for schach, unless it was specifically made for schach. If it was specifically made for schach, then you could use it for schach, because then it was not made for shchiva, even though it could hypothetically be used for shchiva, but if it wasn't made for that purpose, if it was specifically made for the purpose of schach, then it's not royal l'kabel tumas medris, because it's not going to be used for shchiva. That's not what it was made for. It was made for schach. But the Ramah jumps in right away, and he says, what does this mean? Ela imkein asa l'sichuch. If it was made for schach, haga dahainu sheroiv b'nei oisa ha'ir oisin oisa l'schach. It says the Ramah. What the Ramah wants to say over here is, when is it true? The Mechaber seems to be saying a flat-out rule. If the person who made the mat made it for schach, then it's kosher. Even though the default of this type of mat would be that it's intended for shchiva, since the maker made it for schach, it's okay. The Ramah comes to qualify that, and the Ramah says, Bameh dvarim amurim, sort of. When is that true? That if the maker made it for schach, it's okay. Dahainu, sharoiv b'nei oisa ha'ir, oisin oisa l'sichuch. That's talking about a place where the minhag hamakoim is that such mats are made for schach purposes. If, however, it's a place where the minhag hamakoim is that these type of mats are used for sleeping on, then the intent of the maker doesn't matter. Even though the maker will get up and the maker will say, hey, wait a second, I made this for schach, that doesn't help. Why doesn't it help? Because in this locale, anybody who sees this type of mat is going to say that that's a shchiva mat. that's a mat that was made for laying on. And then when they see somebody using it for schach, they're going to assume that a mat that is made for shchiva purposes is kosher for schach. And that's not true. So they're going to come to make a mistake in the halacha. Therefore, what the Mechaber is telling you here is, the Mechaber is saying, a small mat of the type that's usually used for shchiva is not kosher for schach unless the maker made it for schach and it's a place where Roiv B'nai Ha'ir use these kind of mats for schach. Then it's okay. Now, we'll see this kind of inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's break here for a moment and let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah, Eis Katan Yud Daled, on the bottom of Peiches Amid Beis. So the Mechaber said that this halacha that he's going to tell you about the mat, whether it's a smooth mat that it's royal l'shchiva, or it's not a smooth mat, so it's not royal l'shchiva. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Eis Katan Yud Daled, Ein HaLashon Meduktuk. When the Mechaber talks about a mat that's Eina Ru'uya L'Shchiva, his phraseology is a bit imprecise. The Eina Ru'uya Klal, because if we're talking about a mat that's mamish not smooth, and therefore it cannot be used for Shchiva, Amayam Rina D'Stama L'Shchiva. How then could the Mechaber call this mat something which is stama, which the default position is that it's L'Shchiva, right? That's what the Mechaber said. The Mechaber said if it's a small mat, whether it's smooth or it's not smooth, the default position is that it's made for shchiva. How could the default position be that it's made for shchiva if you're telling me that it's eina ru'uya l'shchiva? So it must be that when the Mechaber says it's eina ru'uya l'shchiva, he's being imprecise. He doesn't mean that it's mamish eina ru'uya l'shchiva, ela rather it's eina loymar. What the Mechaber wants to say is she'eina ru'uya kol kach. It's not very usable for shchiva, but it is usable for shchiva in a pinch. V'chein hu behedyo HaTorah, and if you look at the language of the Torah says that outright. Eis Katan Tesvav, im hi kitana. If the mat is a small mat, then the default position is that it was made for shchiva. What does this mean, a small mat? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, hainu kedei shchiva. When we say that it's a small mat, and therefore the default position is that it was intended for shchiva, it means a mat that is of a size that somebody would lay on it. Explains the Sharetzion and Eis Katan Chav Daled, and he brings this down from the Ran, V'hainu shehi kekaimas ish uma'at yoser. We're referring to a mat that's the size of the height of a person, so a person could comfortably lay on it. Uma'at yoser, a little bit longer. A standard bed is a little bit longer than the average sized person, so he could lay on it without feeling like his feet are falling off the bed. Aval yoser mizeh, but a mat that's bigger than that, mikri gedola. That's already called a large mat, which the Mechaber is going to say a large mat is not stama l'shchiva, a large mat is stama l'sichuch. Okay. Eis Katan Tezayin. Such a mat, the Mechaber said, is stama imedes l'shchiva. The default position is that it's intended for laying on, umekabeles tuma, and therefore it's mekabel tuma. What tuma are we talking about? Explains the Chavetz Chaim Pirish. Tekevan de stama l'shchiva, since the default position is that this mat was intended for use for laying on, he ru'uya l'kabel tuma, it's royal l'kabel tuma, l'kesheyishkav ba hazav. Should a zav lay on it, it will be mekabel tumas medris. V'kevan shekain, and since this is something which is a medes l'kabel tuma, it's prepared for use for laying on, and therefore it could be mekabel tumas medris. Af me'ata eina ru'uya l'sichuch, it's automatically even now puzzled to be used as schach. Shekala royal l'kabel tuma ein mesachachin boy, because like we learned at Sif Aleph, anything which is royal l'kabel tuma is puzzled for schach. This is royal l'kabel tumas medris, it's puzzled for schach. The chanal, like we saw earlier. Eis Katan Yud Zayin. So the Mechaber said over here, if it's small, the default position is that it's intended for shchiva. Since it's intended for shchiva, it's royal l'kabel tuma. Since it's royal l'kabel tuma, it's puzzle for use as schach. The ein mesachichin ba, and the Mechaber gave a caveat. The Mechaber said, Eli im kein asal l'sichuch, unless the maker made it for schach. And the Ramah jumped in, and the Ramah said, what does that mean? Unless the maker made it for schach. So the Ramah jumped in and he said that means that the minig hamakom, most of the people of that locale make mats of this type for schach. Eis katan yud zayin, hine, im asa beferish l'sichuch, if the maker made it beferish, he clearly made it for schach, mahani afilu b'makom she'ein minig mevurur be'ir bazeh. Says the Chavetz Chaim, if the maker very clearly made it for schach, then if in that locale there is no specific minig, you'll look at this mat and the Rav will ask people, what do most people in the town use this kind of mat for? And people will say, I don't know. So there is no minig hamakom. If there's no minig hamakom, then if the maker clearly made it for schach, then it's considered a schach mat, and then it's usable as schach. When the Ramah comes and the Ramah gives this caveat, and the Ramah says, hold it, when the Mechaber says that it matters if the maker specifically made it for schach, that means that it's the minig hamakom to use it for schach. What's he coming to say? He's coming to say, if we're in a town where you ask people, what is this type of mat for? And everybody will say, oh, that's a cot. That's a mat that's made for people to sleep on. In that case, that's the case that the Ramah is addressing. When the Ramah gets up and the Ramah qualifies the Mechaber said that the intent of the maker matters. If the maker made it for schach, then it's for schach. The Chavetz Chaim is explaining that to you now. The Chavetz Chaim is telling you what was the intent of the Ramah. The intent of the Ramah was if the maker made it intentionally for schach, so then yes, then the intent of the maker matters, and if there's no minig the other way, if there is no clear minig of what this type of mat is for, then the intent of the maker is going to carry the day, and then this becomes a schach mat. But if it's a place where the minig hamakom is very clear that this is a shchiva mat, then the intent of the maker, that the maker made it for sichuch, isn't going to work. Because nobody knows what's going on between the ears of the maker. Anybody who sees this mat laying on top of a sukkah, they don't know that the maker made it intentionally for schach. And when people see that this type of mat is being used for schach, everybody is going to think that this is kosher for schach, and everybody will end up using mats of this type for schach. So therefore, the intent of the maker has to be balanced with the minig hamakom. That's what the Ramah is coming to tell you over here. The Ramah is coming to tell you, again, it's like a bamed dvarim amurim. When does the intent of the maker matter? The intent of the maker matters when Roiv b'nei Oir use that for schach. If most of the people of the city use it for schach, or, like the Mishnah Berurah says, or if there's no clear minig, then the intent of the maker will carry the day. And if he made it for schach, it's usable for schach. But if Roiv b'nei Oir, if the minig hamakom is that a mat of that type is a cot that people use to lay on, then the minig hamakom cannot carry the day. Then the intent of the maker cannot carry the day in the face of the minig hamakom, which is the opposite. Upa'amim, and the Chavetz Chaim continues and he says, Upa'amim shedavar zeh mahani gam lahakel. There are times when the minig hamakom is also going to create a kula. That's what the Chavetz Chaim means when he says here, Upa'amim shedavar zeh. There are times when this thing, mahani gam lahakel, creates a kula. The davar zeh that he's referring to is the minig hamakom, because that's what he's been saying until now. He's been saying that the Ramah is coming to stress the importance of the minig hamakom. So far, he showed us a chumrah. If the minig hamakom is that this type of mat is always used for laying on, then the intent of the maker cannot counter that. However, sometimes the minig hamakom also creates a kula. Which case is that? Tahainu, imasa stama. If the maker made this mat with any specific intent, you ask the maker, why did you make this mat? Is this a shchiva mat or is it a schach mat? And he says, I don't know, I didn't have a specific intent. Or if somebody got this mat from somewhere and he threw it up on top of the sukkah and we don't know what the maker intended. There's no label on the mat saying that this is a sleeping mat or this is a roofing mat. We don't know. We don't know what the intent of the maker was. In that case, the minig hamakom could create a kula. If absent the intent of the maker, we have a minig hamakom where most people use this type of mat for schach, then we're going to assume that this is a roofing mat and we're going to assume that it's kosher. So the minig hamakom could sometimes work in your favor, and the minig hamakom could sometimes work against you. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mechaber on the third line. So far, the Mechaber discussed the case of the small mat, where the default position is that the mat is made for shchiva purposes. So, if the default is that it's made for shchiva purposes, you cannot use it for schach, unless we have the intent of the maker that could be balanced together with the minig hamakom. If we have no minig hamakom, and we know that the maker made it for schach, it's okay. If the minig of the makom is that most people use this for schach, and we know that the maker made it for schach, it's okay. If the minig of makom is that most people use it for schach, and we don't have a clear intent of the maker, it's okay. But now let's deal with the question of a large mat. So continues the Mechaber, the third line down. Ve'imi gedola. Let's say this mat is a large mat. In that case, stama oimedes l'sichuch. Then the default position is that this is a mat which was made for schach. This is a mat which was made for rolling out on the top of a structure and being used as a roof. Otherwise, why is it so large? We don't need a double king-size mat for sleeping on. And therefore the default position would be that it's kosher for schach and you can use it for schach. Ela im kein asol l'shchiva, unless, again, we know that we have the intent of the maker, that the intent of the maker was to make it for shchiva. And again, the Ramah jumps in and he says, what does that mean? Where is this true that the intent of the maker matters? If the minig hamakom is that this is for shchiva, in that case, it's considered a shchiva mat, and in that case, it's not going to be kosher for schach. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Yudches, Ela im kein asal l'shchiva dahainu. In other words, the Mechaber said that we could have the intent of the maker going against the default position. The default position is that a large mat is made for sichuch, unless we have the intent of the maker, and the intent of the maker is that it was made for shchiva. And the Ramah jumped in and says that's in a place where the minig hamakom is that it was made for shchiva. Says the Chavetz Chaim, ein ritzaynai loymar. When the Ramah jumps in, and the Ramah says that the key factor over here is the minig hamakom, not so much the intent of the maker. Ein ritzaynai loymar, it's not the intention of the Ramah, la'afuke, to contrast and say, im haya haminig l'sichuch, that if the minig hamakom is that this is used for schach, oz gam machshava didei shechashav l'shchiva loy mahanimidi umuter l'sachich. The Chavetz Chaim is coming to tell you like this. We have the Ramah jumped in, and the Ramah said, the Mechaber said, that if the maker made it for shchiva, then it's a shchiva mat and it's puzzle. The Ramah jumped in and said, not so fast. The intent of the maker is not the key factor. The key factor is the minig hamakom. So you could interpret that, and you could say, wait a second, so the Ramah is telling me that the intent of the maker is not so important. Okay, so what if the minig hamakom is that this large mat is a schach mat, and we know that the intent of the maker was to use it for shchiva? Maybe this Ramah is telling me that that's not a problem. The Ramah says we don't have to look so carefully at the intent of the maker. The key factor is the minig hamakom. Okay, so if the minig hamakom is that this large mat is a schach mat, and we happen to know that the maker made it for shchiva, maybe we could discount that based on this Ramah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. Ein ritzaynai loymar. The Ramah does not want to say here, la'afuke im haya haminig l'sichuch, that if the minig hamakom was that this type of mat is a schach mat, oz gam machshava didei shechashav l'shchiva loy mahanimidi umuter l'sachich. The Ramah doesn't mean to now discount the intent of the maker who made it for shchiva and say that this mat is kosher for schach. No, we're not going to discount that intent of the maker. That's not true. If the maker specifically intended that this should be for shchiva, its zikr is something which is royal kabel tuma. It is possible for schach. Ella, rather, what the Ramah is telling me over here is as follows. Ella osi lashmi'inon, the Ramah is coming to teach me the lav dafke im asal l'shchiva, that we don't need a simple reading of the Mechaber would tell me that the default position of a large mat is that it's for schach, and the only way it becomes not schach is if the maker made it for shchiva intentionally, expressly. To that, the Ramah is coming to qualify that and say, no, we don't only have a problem if the maker clearly intended it for shchiva. We also have a problem if roiv b'nei ha'ir, if the minig hamakom is l'shchiva. Ela dehu adin the minig hamakom l'shchiva. If the minig hamakom is l'shchiva, have a ki'ilu asaba atzmai l'shchiva. Now it's as if the maker intended it for shchiva, and it's possible for schach. Let's say we don't know the minig hamakom, then everybody would agree you could use it for schach, unless we know for sure that the maker made it for shchiva. Now the Chavetz Chaim addresses the halacha l'maisa nowadays, and he says, "V'day, you should know, in our regions, we always assume that a mat was made for shchiva purposes. Therefore, even if it was made for schach, you still cannot use it for schach." I'm not going to discuss right now the halachic ramifications of our mats nowadays that are clearly made for schach purposes. We'll discuss that another time. Okay. Says the Mechaber weiter, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down the middle of the line. V'hani mili she'en la safa. This entire conversation is speaking about a mat that does not have a raised rim. Avalim yesh la safa. But if it has a raised perimeter rim, be'inyan sheru'uya lekabel. So now this mat has a base kibel. Now this mat essentially could be used to contain things. It's a flat mat with a raised border, a raised perimeter, a raised edge going around the sides. Now it's a receptacle. It has a base kibel. So im yesh la safa be'inyan sheru'uya lekabel. If it has an edge, so now it's a receptacle. Afilu im nitas fasa. Even if you now go ahead and remove this edge, this raised edge, ein mesachachin ba, you still cannot use it for schach. Because once it became a keli, once it was a receptacle with a raised edge, it became a keli, it's royal kabel tuma. Now, like we learned yesterday, even if you break it by removing the raised edge, now it's shivrei kelim, it's a broken keli. We learned yesterday that once something was a keli and it was royal kabel tuma, it can no longer be used for schach, even if you break it. Says the Mishnah is cutting your test, be'inyan sheru'uya lekabel, if it has a raised edge so that it's royal kabel tuma. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, Kevan sheru'uya lekabel, since it's fit to be used as a receptacle, hariyesha le'ashem kli, it now becomes a keli, umekabelas tuma, and now it's royal lekabel tuma, ve'ein mesachichin ba, and therefore you cannot use it for schach. V'hani mili bistama, this is talking about a default case. Azamrina, the Kevin Sheyesh La Safa, that's when we say that if it has a raised rim, Muchach Dinasis LeKabbalah, it's clear that it was made for use as a receptacle, Umemela Mekabelas Tuma, and therefore it's Mekabel Tuma as a Keli. Avalim Daita Behedyo L'Sichuch, but if when it was made, it was clearly intended for use as schach, then afapisha yesh la safa, even if it has a rim, ena mekabelas tuma, it's still not mekabel tuma. The kibul zeh ena chashuv klum, and the fact that technically it could be used as a base kibel because it has a raised rim matters not at all. Because it's very nice that technically it has a base kibel and it could be used as a keli. It wasn't made for that. It's not asuya l'kabel. So it's not a keli, it's not makabel tuma. However, v'yesh me'achrayim, there are those achrayim shesoivrin who hold the kevan sheyesh la safa, that once it has a rim, b'chol gavdi mekabelas tuma, now it's makabel tuma, despite the intent of the maker, ve'ein mesachikin ba, and it cannot be used for schach. Ois katan chaf, the mat that was used, the mat that has a raised rim, so that has a base kibel, we consider it a keli and it can't be used. Even if you took off that raised rim, says the Chavetz Chaim, Dumya dechol shivrei kelim. This is the same halacha as we discussed yesterday by any shivrei kelim. She'ein mesachikin behen min derabanan, where the Chachamim were mesakin that you cannot use a broken keli for schach, even though it's no longer royal l'kabel tuma, because once it was at one point royal l'kabel tuma, you can't use it at all for schach ever again. The Chanal b'siv beis. Now we go to the words of the Ramah at the end of Sif Vav. B'makom shenagu likbaya machatzalos bagagin ke'ein tikra. In locales where they regularly use these types of mats as roofing material on houses. You have a place, I guess, where the climate allows for it, and these mats are regularly used for the roofs over houses. So then, ein mesachikin behen, then you cannot use them at all. What the Mechaber wants to say is, even if this mat was clearly made for schach, and it's not makabel tuma, it's not a keli, and it's not makabel tuma, you still cannot use it for schach. In a locale where this is what forms the roofs of the houses, then you cannot use this as material to use for schach on a sukkah, because then people are going to come to eat in their house on sukkahs. The type of mat that is used to form the ceiling and the roof of a house is pasal min HaTorah. Because when you put it up, you're not putting it up l'shem tzeil, you're not putting it up l'shem tzeil sukkah, you're putting it up because you're building a roof. You're putting it up l'shem gag, l'shem dira, and that would be pasal min HaTorah. I'm going to have to stop over here. I'm sorry for the little bit of an abbreviated share, but I'm going to have to stop over here tonight. Me'ez Hashem, tomorrow we'll continue with Siv Zayin. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should say Yeshua Sefus and Parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Kal Tzedek. V'mher v'yameinu Amen. Be well.